Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Chapter number 10. Yunus. Johan. The theme of this chapter is to believe in fate and divine decree. And in the whole chapter, all over, it stresses that God runs the universe wisely and with truth. In this chapter, it states that God is all-wise, Al-Hakim, and all-knowing, and determinate. God is the truth, and He did not create this world in rest. If you notice in this chapter, the noun truth and true is repeated more than 23 times in order to stress that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the truth and He did not create this world in rest. So, if you believe in all that, what is said, one would accept fate and divine decree. Let's look at the first verses of this chapter. How does it begin? By mentioning in the first verses wisdom of God. Then, in the second verses, God chose His prophet with wisdom. But with starting verse number 3, God's wisdom in creating the universe is manifest. The verses elaborate on God's wisdom creating the universe, urging people to contemplate and think in God's creation. So you will find in the first verses of this chapter a lot of examples about God's creation in the world, to urge us to get to know that Allah is wise and everything is created in creation. It's full of wisdom, full of things to contemplate and think about. So that will lead you to believe in fate and divine decree. While going and reciting through the chapter, there's an important verse number 44, in which إن الله لا يظلم الناس شيئا ولكن الناس أنفسهم يظلمون. It states that God does not wrong anybody, though some people think so. People should resign to God's fate. Then, in this chapter, it starts to present examples about people's attitude and reaction to God's fate. Then, at the last part of this chapter, the stories of some of the prophets are tackled, starting with Nuh, relied on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and depended totally on Him in all submissiveness, tawakkal ala Allah, and then Musa, who also reliance and submission to God in verses 84. So, these stories selected are prophets who trusted God, to stress that those who believe in fate and divine decree put their trust in God. And at the end of the chapter, 2 examples are cited in which the divine decree was manifest. They are about Pharaoh, and Jonah's people. As both of them, Pharaoh and Jonah people, were a bit in the same situation, as both of them were away from God, God's path, being infidel and wrongdoers. But guess what happened? Pharaoh drowned and Allah punished him by drowning him, whereas Jonah's people were rescued in verses 90. So why God saved Jonah's people, whereas Pharaoh was drowned? Of course, for there is a wisdom behind that. God knew beforehand that if Pharaoh had been saved, he would have become a worse, unjust, corrupt person, but the Jonah's people were eventually guided. So God knew before what is the end path of every person. However, we can easily visualize that when Jonah's people believed, they became among the devoted worshipper of God. So really, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved those people, their path was they worshipped God and they were devoted to Him. So the message is that thus one does not always know God's wisdom behind punishing some people and rescuing others. But you should know Allah is all wise. At the end of the chapter, it stresses on one should put his trust in God, resort to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to resign to his fate. And one should never have doubts about God's justice. And everything takes place in this universe is run by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God. So one must resign to divine decree. Thank you for listening to this chapter. See you in other chapter.